Imagine that you made a monumental scientific discovery. After years of work, you submit your findings to the most prestigious journal, and it flies past peer review. The world celebrates your discovery. Newspapers, blogs, interviews. There's even rumors of great prizes in your future, attached to large financial gifts, a comfy professorship at any university you want, fame, fortune, immortality. But then, on one Tuesday afternoon, you discover something horrible. Your stomach feels like it's turning inside out as you realize that you have made a mistake. Your discovery was wrong. Take a moment. How would you react to that finding? Would your brain even allow you to see the truth given the enormous impact it implies on your career? Perhaps your programming might simply reject it and conveniently forget the mistake. If not, would you consider consciously covering it up? In all likelihood, it would take your colleagues many years to discover the mistake. By then, you could secure a good position somewhere, or maybe you just keep arguing the opposite view forever, keeping the public confused. After all, they wouldn't be able to tell who was right, so you could feign some semblance of credibility. Or maybe, just maybe, you might stand up and admit the mistake with clear eyes and openness. You know, history is replete with countless tales of scientific discoveries that were later refuted or retracted, because the truth is that science is inextricably a human endeavor, and since we are flawed creatures, we will sometimes come to erroneous conclusions. We have to concede that. Such missteps can occur because of bias, fatigue, or carelessness, but perhaps most painfully, sometimes you can make no mistake and still end up with the wrong answer. The question is not whether these mistakes will happen again or not, because they will. That's just inevitable. The real question is, what do we do with a hand that has been dealt to us? Astronomy, being the oldest of the sciences, has certainly seen many such spurious claims. As someone who studies planets, regular viewers will know that one of my favorite cases is that of the Martian canals, which became a widespread belief in the late 19th century. In the 20th century, another infamous example is the claimed planetary system around Barnard's star. Peter van der Kamp was a professor at Swarthmore College, where he claimed the discovery of what would have been the first exoplanet way back in 1969, 2 decades before the first real one was reported. Van der Kamp used the astrometric method, that is, monitoring the positions of stars very carefully to see if they wobble at all due to the influence of a companion planet. By the way, Barnard's star is the fastest moving star on the sky, so it has to be said that his target was somewhat of a peculiar choice here. In the years that followed, other astronomers demonstrated that the reported wobble apparently occurred each time the objective lens was removed and cleaned. Yet more, this was also true for hundreds of other stars observed the same way. It turns out that Van der Kamp was not observing a real planetary system, but rather the maintenance schedule. Van der Kamp never backed down though. In fact, he even claimed further planets around different stars. He lived to the age of 93, passing in the year 1995, but to my knowledge, he never retracted those claims. You know, I remember when I first learned about that story that it really saddened me. Scientists were supposed to be the seekers of truth, objective, factual. So why wouldn't Van der Kamp just retract his claim in the face of such overwhelming data? I've often wondered, did he internally know that he was wrong but refused to publicly say so? Or had he somehow convinced himself that he was right, no matter what anyone else said or what evidence was shown to him in the contrary? Fortunately, not all scientists are quite so stubborn, and there is one counterexample in particular, one case that I really wanted to share with you on this channel. A case that may have even saved exoplanets as a field. It's an almost Hollywood moment that's so incredulous it feels like it must be apocryphal. So I invited the leading scientists involved to the channel to share what really happened. Before I share his story, I just want to acknowledge the enormous mental stress and pressure that these moments are filled with. This video focuses on how this plays out in science, but look, I think the challenge of how to admit a giant personal mistake is something that we can all relate to, whether it be in our business, our finances, our job, or even our relationships with our friends or our family. These moments can be crushing, the kind of thing where you wish the world would just swallow you up. But listen, you don't have to face these challenges alone, and today's sponsor, BetterHelp, is there for you if you need some support. I think that it's incredibly important to look after yourself, and that includes what you eat, what you drink, your exercise program, but more important than really all of that is looking after your mental health. BetterHelp make this more convenient than it's ever been. They match you with a therapist online who will listen and help with whatever challenges you're going through. Therapy has helped my family through some major challenges, such as how to deal with the stress of trying to keep up with all of the demands that society expects upon us, like being a good parent, a good sibling, a good employee, a good friend, a good partner, and ultimately coming to the realization that you can't be perfect at everything, and that's okay. To get started, head to betterhelp.com/coolworlds, link down below in the description, and that will give you 10% off your first month where you can switch therapists at any time for any reason. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring us today. Now back to the video. So my guest today is Professor Matthew Bales, a giant in the field of pulsars and also recently discovered fast radio bursts. Just for context, this guy was a recent recipient of the Chinese Nobel Prize, the Shaw Prize, so it is truly an honor for him to be sharing his story with us today. To set this up, let's rewind to the year 1990, when we knew of precisely 0 exoplanets. Now, thanks to stories like that of Peter van der Kamp, there was a huge amount of skepticism and doubting about any such claims. However, there was also an expectation that surely planets must be out there, and so to be first was to be immortalized, to become a legend. Such a claim was made in 1990, led by my guest, Bales, who had just finished wrapping up his PhD at the time. The claimed planet orbited a pulsar, that's a tiny dead star that spins incredibly fast and emits intense radio beams from its poles. By monitoring the timing of those beams as they sweep past the Earth, causing pulses, one can check for potential wobbles due to planets. The next part of the story gets really fascinating because Bales' boss, Andrew Lynn, went to a major astronomy conference and admitted in front of everybody that they had made a mistake, unprompted, without any outside pressure. And keep in mind, the whole world had been celebrating their success up to that point. This really is quite shocking because I can honestly count on one hand the number of times that I have seen an astronomer stand up in a talk and admit that their paper was totally wrong. Legend then says that the crowd reacted by giving him a standing ovation. Now look, I've been to a lot of astronomy conferences and I've never seen such a thing. So although I'd long heard this story, I think I kind of assumed it was apocryphal. And so I really wanted to chat with Matthew Bales directly and find out what really happened. Obviously, you've had a remarkable career, working on everything from fast radio bursts or the evolution and birth of these pulsars. And yet, your early career had this event, PSR 1820-10, which is notorious as this kind of retracted exoplanet. And so maybe you can just tell me, specifically, what was the discovery aha part of that journey for you as a researcher?
Yeah, so the way that you time pulsars, at least at Jodrell, was you would determine what was called the site arrival times. When did the pulse hit the Earth? And then you would transform that to the solar system barycenter. And we had a series of master's students working with us. One was a guy called Setnam Shamar. And Setnam had really only just started on his master's, and I taught him how to use my new graphical interface to basically try and fit how many rotations there were between observations. So you'd look at the pulsar, you go, oh, it's rotating, I can't remember what the rotation period is, say every half a second or something. And you would sort of guess how many times it rotated, and you would try and get what's called a phase-connected solution.
Right.
And I remember just before going home one night, Andrew Lyon had been teaching Setnam how to do all this, and they'd managed to connect some of the points over the course of a few days or weeks. And it had a sort of a connection, but there was a little bit of excess wiggle or noise and so on. And Andrew said to me something like, oh, look at this, we're starting to get phase connection. Maybe there's something exciting happening here. Setnam to keep looking at the data, and he added more data in, and he saw this kind of wiggle with roughly a 6-month period in it, and managed to connect it over the several years of data we had. The amplitude corresponded to the kind of delay you would expect from a planet going around in an orbit of 6 months, and about 10 times the mass of the Earth. And unless the thing was ridiculously face-on, we'd discovered the first planet around the solar system. So that was all very exciting, and there was a lot of glory to be had by being the first people to discover a planet outside the solar system.
So how were you feeling at that point? Were you skeptical? Were you enthused? Where were you at?
Look, I think at that point, well, up until that point, I'd had a very successful PhD and written a Nature paper, and everything was going sort of brilliantly, really. I just thought this was the next logical step in my brilliant career, and probably didn't stop and think about, oh, what if this is wrong? What I found out about 6 months later was that although I'd added to these wonderful graphical interfaces to things, there were actually some auxiliary files which stored the coordinates of the pulsar. And instead of a unified system where the thing that transformed the coordinates to the barycenter and the thing that fit for the planetary parameters sharing the same file, they're actually different files. And although Setnam had done everything right, he didn't know that there was this kind of other file which you had to update in an iterative procedure with the coordinates. And I'm not sure if I knew it or whether I'd just forgotten it or whatever, but I didn't know that that was also a part of the puzzle.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the initial position of the pulsar was sufficiently far from its true position that an approximation used, which is fine if there's only an arc second or something between the position and where you are, but instead it was like 360 arc seconds or something, induced a 6-month sinusoid in your residuals. And so we were pretty desperate for the glory, I guess, and we dashed off a Nature paper. And
was it exactly 6 months, or was it?
No, but it probably wasn't more than a few sigma away from 6 months, which should have been raising some alarm bells. But I think we were more focused on being the first people to discover a planet than thinking, oh, we better make sure this is right.
Because of course you had competition from Alexander Borskan's group. So was that in your mind that, oh, we could get, they're probably hot on our heels here, we need to be quick with this?
I didn't really think of him as competition, but there were a lot of people trying to find planets in other ways.
Yeah.
Most planet attempts back in the 80s and 90s have ended in sort of with lack of confirmation or whatever. So we thought we had an edge on the traditional planets around normal star people because pulsar timing is so much more accurate than radial velocity work. So I think we're a little bit cocky about it, and probably a little bit too focused on being the first than being a rigorous checker. And we submitted it to Nature and we got the referee reports. And I remember one of them just said, congratulations to the authors or something, which probably was not what we needed. And the other one said, gee, I hope you're right, because this would really be bad if it was wrong, and make sure you check everything. And whoever that person was, and I suspect I knew who it was, but they were very wise in retrospect.
And when did you start to get the feeling or the first hint that something was off, and what was that emotional roller coaster like?
Yeah, very very devastating actually. But I think we published the paper and then we intensified how often we observed the planet pulsar, and it had a prediction of how it should behave, and it was exactly where we thought it should. So it had done another complete cycle, and we were sort of basking in glory, really, getting invited lectures and so on. But I remember there was great pressure to name the planet. And I remember a few days before I learned that the planet didn't exist, I said to Andrew, oh, we should, do something about the name. And he was quite reticent to do it. And I thought, oh, he's being a bit cagey here. Well, he's sort of lost his enthusiasm. And I only found out like a few days later that he had discovered that these coordinates in the two files were a mismatch, and he updated them, and he went plot, and an anti-planet appeared in the data, and then he fit for a sin I, which was the amplitude of the sinusoid, and the residuals just went perfectly flat. And he said he just hugged the monitor as all the ramifications went through his head. And I think it was a Monday morning, but it was certainly very early in the morning, like 7 a.m. or something. There was a knock at my door, and it was Andrew, and he looked very sheepish, and he looked up at me and he said, you know why I'm here? And I said, the planet? And he said, yes. And I said, it's gone? And he said, I'm afraid so. And that was probably certainly the worst feeling I've ever had in science. And so he came in, and I wanted him to explain to me why the planet had disappeared. He was actually a remarkably good teacher. He's still alive, actually. He's probably early 80s. Easily one of the smartest people I've ever worked with. Just remarkably prolific and a great teacher, and also the author of, papers with tens of thousands of citations and books, and you name it.
Yeah, a giant, yeah.
And I think for him it was absolutely devastating, as it was for me. But I didn't have much of a career to look back on, whereas he was this greatly respected figure. So he explained to me how this had, why it was definitely gone. And it took me a while to kind of
accept it.
Yeah, I mean, it was like, oh shit, this is embarrassing. I've been literally on the front page of national newspapers and on TV shows, and and like, it's hard enough to get a permanent job without something like this in your history. And so it was very devastating, and I felt very bad for the poor student too. And we'd been on Sky After Dark with Patrick Moore, I think his name was.
I think that by now many people have heard about the reported discovery of a new planet. And I don't mean a planet in our own solar system. This is a planet of a neutron star. And at this stage, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Matthew Bales and Setnam Shima. Matthew, what drew your attention to this particular pulsar, and why is it known as 1829-10?
Well, astronomers have a coordinate system that they've applied to the sky.
I think we were due to give this plenary talk at the AAS meeting. We'd been invited to give the plenary talk on the pulsar planet, and Alex Volson had been invited to talk about his planets. We realized we had to write a retraction letter.
Yeah.
Because it was probably only going to be a month or few before several other groups would say, well, we don't see the planet. So Andrew said, you can stay here and handle the press, and I'm going to go and tell everybody at the AAS meeting, how we stuffed up, really. So Andrew, gave his talk at the AAS meeting.
Yeah.
And he was first, and then I think Alex was going to be the next speaker. And Andrew just went up, and I think it was still in the era of overhead transparencies. And he used to do these remarkably beautiful presentations, and he explained why we thought we'd found a pulsar and all the things it might have been. And one of them was like a software error. And then he sort of pointed out that, we had these different files for how we do the barocentric corrections, and they weren't aligned, and this induced the planet in our data. And I think he just said something at the end like, and we're sorry. And he just sort of walked off the stage, and apparently there was an instantaneous standing ovation, which I think was a great gift from the community to us, because I think we felt kind of ashamed, and that we'd sort of wasted everybody's time. And
I don't see it that way. I think you gave us, I honestly think you gave us the gift by having the courage to admit that. It would have been so easy to have slunk away, to have not done the plenary, or push back with with ambiguous statements or something. But I think the fact you did that, it's so rare that you see that. And I don't know how it is in the world of pulsars, but certainly in exoplanets, it feels like it's very rare. You'll see someone give a plenary talk and say we were wrong.
Yeah, but I've never seen it. Probably will never see it again. I wasn't at the meeting, but it was great. I think it kept us in science, because at that point I was thinking, this is a disaster. It's just going to be so embarrassing to ever show my face ever again at a pulsar conference. How can I go on doing this? It's just, it's just like, it was really embarrassing. And also, your parents and so on who don't really understand how science works, it's kind of hard to explain to them that, and this is a big stuff up. So it's embarrassing on multiple levels. But I kind of knew that Andrew and I were actually quite good at doing pulsar research. And we had a fantastic telescope with which to pursue pulsars. And we were actually sitting on a whole lot of other discoveries that we then published over the next few years, many in Nature. And I think one day Andrew said to me something like, and I'm paraphrasing heavily, but it was kind of like, we just have to get back into it. And I think we've been much more cautious ever since. I remember one day in particular, I woke up and I thought, I don't want to leave science because of a failure. I need to demonstrate to everybody that I can do it and that it's actually the right career for me. Because if I leave now, it'll just be because of a failure, and what sort of life will I have?
Yeah.
So I do think it was certainly a massive turning point. I did see a couple of people kind of sniggering, and I think if somebody else had stuffed up at that level, I probably would have sniggered. But I think it was very good for me to actually learn about failure, and that not everything is glory. I think I would have been a little bit insufferable if that had actually been a true discovery, and I would have just seen it as like a way of acknowledging my genius and so on. So I think it has made me...
some humility, yeah. I see it not only as part of your story, but part of the story of exoplanets, of this early days. And there's nothing more I respect than somebody who admits they were wrong and moves on to do other great things. And you really exemplify that with Andrew as well. So I just want to say thank you to you both for doing that.
Yeah, well, thanks for that, David.
So there you have it. Astronomers really did give a standing ovation, but not to some claim of giant success, but rather to the admission of a mistake. Applause for preserving scientific integrity in the face of what must have been crushing personal disappointment. You know, in a world that seems to celebrate stubbornness, it's pretty amazing to see such a thing. And so it's really no surprise that Bales went on to become a giant in his field in the years that followed. As for the study of exoplanets, I really think that this moment could have saved it as a field. You have to understand that back in 1990, the field was nascent. It had been muddied by these previous spurious claims, and credibility was frankly rock bottom. This was really its most vulnerable moment. Now, presumably the mistake would have been caught eventually, but a stubborn team might have led the field into a spiraling war of words, ripping itself apart before it ever got going. A lesser scientist might have even been tempted to cover this up, long burdening the field with the perception of being a bogus scientific enterprise. Look, when we look back at the history of science, we often like to celebrate and hold up those moments of first discovery, first detection as the key moments. But for me, I would hold this moment up right alongside as equally just as important. But as you heard, this was certainly painful to admit, and I suspect that many of us have decisions like this in our lives that we have to make. The short-term easy fix or the painful long-term solution. So next time that you face such a dilemma, I hope that you will remember this story and maybe draw some inspiration from it, because in the end, making the right decision was the best thing for everyone involved. It will work out. So until next time, stay thoughtful and stay curious. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, be sure to drop us a like. It really helps us out. And did you know that you can actually also support my research team, the Cool Worlds Lab, right here at Columbia University by using the link up above, just like our latest supporters. That is Christopher Say. Thank you so much to you, Christopher. And also Rod Clifton. Rod's actually been a long-term supporter, but last month somehow accidentally donated way too much, and yet said to me that he was totally cool with that because he wants to support what we do. So a huge thank you to you as well, Rod. So until next time, have an awesome one out there.